Despite being a critically acclaimed series on the Game Boy Advance and the DS, the Advance Wars games have never been a top seller for either handheld and have remained a hidden gem from the early 2000s. With Reboot Camp's release announced for April 21st on the Switch, will this be the time for Advance Wars to shine? So, Reboot Camp has been announced, but what is it? It will be the 5th game in the Advance Wars series, and as its name suggests, it's a reboot of the first 2 games, both released on the Game Boy Advance. You might not have heard much about these games, and there is a good reason for that, but first let's talk about what kind of games these are. Advance Wars is the first Western game from the Wars series, released in 2001 on the Game Boy Advance in the US and later in Europe and Japan. It's a turn-based strategy game that takes place in Cosmoland as you test your tactics against the might of neighboring nations, and ultimately an external threat to the land as a whole. The color palette is a vibrant mix of reds, blues, yellows, and greens, with a Western cartoon style to the characters and vehicles. The story and campaign is told over a series of missions, giving you a top-down view of your army and full control over the battlefield. In the story, you get to play as advisor to the commanding officer on one side, completing objectives or eliminating enemy forces from the map entirely. Act as advisor in name only. In reality, you are commanding what happens during play, win or lose. A mix of terrain for movement and defense, occasional fog of war, and a variety of units on land, sea, and air presents a lot of depth during these missions. Learning which unit types are most effective against each other, leveraging ranged and direct attack combat, and listening to your gut instincts is your path to success. Oh, and I didn't even mention hit points, building new vehicles by capturing specific buildings in some missions, managing unit fuel and ammo, using APCs to transport infantry and resupply your vehicles. This game has depth. If you're not too familiar with turn-based strategy or tactics games, you might already know about turn-based combat in general. Battles in JRPGs have used turn-based tactics for several decades, from the Final Fantasy series, to the Persona series, to the Trail series, and many more. While JRPGs only use turn-based gameplay during combat, games like Advance Wars use tactics as a key mechanic and sit within a wider selection of hits in the genre. One worth calling out is the XCOM series, released on PC and console. XCOM and its sequels have remained successful over a number of console generations and have carved out enough space to define and maintain the genre since the PS1 generation. Being able to think tactically without the pressure of a clock is widely appealing, and while the neighboring real-time strategy genre is successful, games like XCOM and Advance Wars have continued to show how tactics-based play can be a satisfying alternative. Commanding officers, or COs, are another key element of your strategy too. Each CO has unique traits that affect your units differently, with their own super ability that charges up as you damage and defeat the enemy. Choosing when to unleash this power can turn the tide in a challenging fight, and leveraging the CO's unit's strengths while mitigating any weaknesses helps guide you into a winning set of maneuvers on the battlefield. Don't forget that the enemy also has a CO who is your equal and with their own strengths and superpower. Keep an eye on their power meter when they take a turn and get ready for it to fire at exactly the wrong time for you. In the first Advance Wars game, each CO has one power that can be used when fully charged, but in the second game you gain 2 powers, with one at half power and a stronger attack once it's fully charged. If you're willing to wait for a full charge, the superpower version of your ability can be a lifesaver, but most missions are long enough to earn at least 1 to 2 charges, so don't be afraid to trigger it when it's available. At the end of each mission, you're graded on speed, power, and technique, earning an overall rank and XP that can be used to unlock battle maps and additional COs for single and multiplayer skirmishes. Multiplayer has been available in the series since the first Advance game, provided you and a friend could get together with a link cable, and you brought plenty of batteries to keep you playing. Reboot Camp is remaking the first 2 games, and from the teasers we've seen during Nintendo Direct a few years ago, there are new animations for the COs, voiceovers, and a combination of unlockable extras like battle maps and outfits. It'll be interesting to see if the campaigns from each game is played separately, or if the style of gameplay has been equalized and results in a more cohesive experience. Now, I hinted that you might not have come across the Advance Wars games when they were playable on the Game Boy Advance. The release of a war-themed game in the US was unfortunately timed with a street date of September 10th, 2001. This would result in pushing the European launch to mid-2002, and the eventual Japan release to 2004, and then only as a compilation release with Advance Wars 2. Sales of the series in North America did reach 500,000 units, which is a significant number, but compared with the likes of Mario, Zelda, and Star Fox, it wasn't enough to sustain further releases on the Game Boy Advance. The Nintendo DS did see two games released in the 2000s, Dual Strike in 2005 and Days of Ruin in 2008. Though Days of Ruin moved away from the style and characters of the earlier games, appearing more of a standalone title and the last entry in the West. You could argue that having entries only on handheld consoles, combined with the unfortunate first release date, contributed to low sales overall. Personally, I would have enjoyed seeing a GameCube Advance Wars game in the 2000s. The Wii's control scheme would have been a challenge to the gameplay in my opinion, so the GameCube would have been the only choice. Until now. The announcement of Reboot Camp back in 2021 for the Switch rekindled the love for the Advance Wars series that had laid dormant for many years. After delaying it into 2022, early Nintendo Directs gave us a bigger look at the almost finished game, but without any certainty of getting it into our hands. The updated release date of April 21st for this year has fans ready to play, and while we may never fully understand the reasons for the release delay, my hope is the game has benefited from the extra time available. The remaster of both games and the inclusion of these new features has me looking forward to the Reboot Camp's release. A whole new generation of gamers will get their hands on a series I've cherished since I first owned a Game Boy Advance, and I truly hope it reaches the sales numbers on the Switch that signals a return to the franchise. Well, we're definitely deep into the era of the remaster and the remakes of games gone by, though this reboot does seem a little more unique in the way it's going to combine both original games into something a little newer. What's your prediction for Reboot Camp? Is this the start of a resurgence for tactics-heavy games, or is it only going to be picked up and played by old fans like me with retro-tinted glasses? Share your predictions in the comments, and hit me up when you're ready to duke it out in multiplayer. I'll bring the battery pack.